A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The girl would live, which was more than Serafina could say for her own reputation in this miserable border settlement. But at least she'd done what she came here to do, which was save a life, even if it meant enduring the whispers and the stares and the barely concealed fear that followed her everywhere, like a shadow she couldn't shake, no matter how far she ran or how many people she helped. The merchant's daughter lay sleeping peacefully on the narrow bed, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths that just 3 days ago had been shallow and rattling with the kind of wet, desperate sound that meant death was already spreading its roots through her lungs, waiting to drag another soul down into the darkness that seemed to follow Sarah wherever she went. Or at least that's what people said, that she brought death with her like a plague carried on the wind. Sarah pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders and looked down at her hands. These hands that had just spent 72 hours channeling healing energy into a dying girl, pouring her own life force into wounds that had been carved by a bear's claws across the child's chest and back, deep enough that the local healer had declared her beyond saving and told the family to prepare for burial instead of recovery. But Sarah had arrived in Grey Hollow that same afternoon. Drawn by some instinct she'd learned to trust over her 3 years of wandering, some internal compass that pulled her toward suffering like a moth toward flame, and she'd offered her services even though she could see the way the merchant's wife had recoiled when she'd pushed back her hood and revealed the long silver hair that marked her as different, as other, as wrong, in ways that made normal wolves uncomfortable in their own skin. The merchant had been desperate enough to accept her help despite his wife's protests, desperate enough to let the strange silver-haired Omega into their home and trust her with their dying daughter's life. And Sarah had worked without stopping for 3 days straight, barely eating, barely sleeping, just pouring everything she had into keeping that little girl alive because she couldn't fail again, couldn't watch another child die the way her brother Thomas had died, with his small hand clutching hers and his eyes wide with confusion about why his big sister couldn't make the fever stop, couldn't make the pain go away, couldn't save him from the illness that had swept through their pack like wildfire and taken 47 lives before burning itself out. Thomas had been 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair like their mother, and eyes that had sparkled with mischief and joy until the sickness had turned them glassy and distant. And Sarah had held him through his final hours, had tried everything she knew, every healing technique their mother had taught her, every herb and poultice and prayer. But nothing had worked, and when he'd taken his last shuddering breath, she'd felt something inside herself crack open like a fault line spreading through stone, and her hair had started turning silver that very night, strand by strand, until within a week it had gone from rich chestnut brown to this metallic silver that caught light like moonbeams and marked her as cursed in the eyes of everyone who looked at her. The pack had blamed her for the deaths, not officially perhaps, but in whispered conversations and sidelong glances and the way people had started crossing to the other side of the path when they saw her coming, as if death itself clung to her skin and might transfer to them through proximity or touch. They'd said her silver hair was the moon goddess's punishment, a visible sign that she'd failed in her duty as a healer, that she'd somehow absorbed the darkness of all those deaths, and it had manifested in her appearance as a warning to others to stay away from her cursed touch. And even though the rational part of her mind knew that was nonsense, that hair didn't change color because of magical curses, that illnesses killed people regardless of a healer's best efforts, she couldn't entirely silence the voice in her head that whispered, maybe they were right, maybe she was cursed. Maybe everyone she tried to save was doomed from the moment she laid her hands on them. Damien Blackwater had been the only one who'd seemed to look past her appearance. The only one who'd courted her despite the whispers and the warnings. And for 2 beautiful years, Sarah had let herself believe that maybe she'd found someone who saw her for who she really was, instead of what she looked like, or what had happened during the plague that had devastated their pack. He'd been handsome in that conventional way that young alphas often were, with dark hair and strong features and the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was destined for pack leadership someday. And he'd told her he loved her, that her silver hair was beautiful and unique, that he didn't believe in curses or superstitions, that he wanted to spend his life with her and build a family together and prove to everyone that she was worthy of love and acceptance, despite what had happened with her brother and the others who'd died. They'd gotten engaged in a formal ceremony with the entire pack as witnesses, and Sarah had worn flowers in her silver hair and a dress her grandmother had made. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she'd felt something like hope beginning to bloom in the frozen wasteland of her heart. Like maybe she could have a future that wasn't defined by loss and grief and running from the shadows of her past. The rejection had come 2 months later, on what was supposed to be their mating ceremony, with 300 pack members gathered to witness their union, and Sarah standing in front of them, all wearing her ceremony dress, and feeling her heart hammering with nervous excitement about finally belonging somewhere, finally having someone who chose her despite everything. Damien had looked at her standing there with her silver hair braided with white ribbons and her pale skin flushed with happiness, and something had shifted in his expression. Something cold and calculating had replaced the warmth she'd grown used to seeing in his eyes. And he'd said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear that he couldn't do it. Couldn't bind himself to a woman who was so clearly marked by death itself that he'd tried to overlook her curse. But he couldn't ignore what everyone else could see so plainly, which was that she was unnatural, wrong, dangerous, and he refused to risk his own life and the lives of their future children by tying his fate to someone who brought death wherever she went, like a storm cloud, raining misery on everyone unfortunate enough to stand too close. He'd torn up their mate contract right there in front of everyone, the paper ripping with a sound that had seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence, and Sarah had stood frozen in shock and humiliation while 300 pairs of eyes stared at her with a mixture of pity and relief, as if they'd all been waiting for this exact moment, as if they'd known all along that someone like her could never really be accepted, no matter how hard she tried to prove her worth. The pack alpha had banished her that same day, had given her 1 hour to gather her belongings and leave pack territory or face arrest for trespassing. And not a single person had spoken up in her defense. Not her grandmother, who'd raised her after her parents died. Not the families she'd helped through illnesses and injuries over the years. Not the children she'd taught or the elderly she'd cared for. Because at the end of the day, she was the girl with silver hair who couldn't save her own brother. And that mark of failure would follow her no matter where she went or what she did. So she'd walked away from the only home she'd ever known, with nothing but a pack full of supplies and her mother's healing journal and the clothes on her back. And she'd been walking ever since, moving from settlement to settlement, offering her healing services to anyone desperate enough to accept help from a cursed rogue Omega, with no pack and no family and no future beyond the next town and the next patient and the next inevitable departure when people started getting too uncomfortable with her presence. She'd saved dozens of lives over the past 3 years, had pulled people back from the edge of death through sheer stubbornness and skill, and the mysterious healing gift that seemed to flow through her hands whenever she touched someone who was injured or ill. But she never stayed long enough to see if her patients thrived beyond their immediate recovery. Never allowed herself to form attachments that would only hurt when the inevitable rejection came. Because it always came eventually. the whispers and the sideways glances and the polite suggestions that maybe she should move along to the next town where her particular skills might be more appreciated. The door to the sick room opened behind her, and Sarah turned to find the merchant standing there, with a leather pouch in his hands and an expression on his face that was equal parts gratitude and discomfort. The look of a man who was thankful for her help, but would be relieved when she was gone, and he didn't have to explain to his neighbors why he'd allowed someone like her into his home. He pressed the pouch into her hands without meeting her eyes, and mumbled something about how there was some dried meat and bread in addition to the coins they'd agreed upon, and how they were grateful for what she'd done for their daughter. Truly grateful. But perhaps it would be best if she moved on soon because people were talking, and it was making his wife nervous having her here. And surely Sarah could understand that they had to think of their family's reputation in the community. Sarah took the pouch and nodded because what else could she do? Because this was the pattern her life had fallen into, and she'd learned not to fight it. Had learned that some battles couldn't be won no matter how skilled you were or how pure your intentions. And she gathered her few belongings from the corner where she'd been sleeping on the floor for the past 3 days, and pulled her hood up to cover her distinctive silver hair, even though it wouldn't matter, because everyone in Grey Hollow already knew what she looked like, and would be whispering about the silver-haired healer who'd passed through their settlement for years after she was gone. She left through the back door without saying goodbye to the little girl she'd saved, without waiting to see if the child would wake up and smile and run to her parents with the kind of joy that made all the exhaustion and pain worthwhile, because Sarah had learned the hard way that it was easier to leave before people could tell her to go, easier to walk away on her own terms than to wait for the inevitable moment when even gratitude wasn't enough to overcome fear and superstition. The forest road stretched out before her as she left Grey Hollow behind, the autumn afternoon turning cold as clouds gathered overhead and blocked out the weak sunlight that had been struggling through the trees, and Sarah pulled her cloak tighter and tried not to think about where she was going or what she would do when she got there, because the answer was always the same, which was nowhere and nothing and more of this endless wandering, until she either found somewhere that would accept her or died alone in the wilderness, and became just another cautionary tale about what happened to wolves who were marked by the moon goddess for failure. She was so lost in her own thoughts, so focused on putting one foot in front of the other and trying not to feel the bone-deep exhaustion that came from 3 days of intensive healing work, that she didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were almost on top of her, didn't register the danger until 12 horses burst through the trees and surrounded her in a circle of muscle and steel and white military uniforms that marked them as elite soldiers from one of the great packs. And Sarah's hand went instinctively to the small knife at her belt, even though she knew it would be useless against 12 trained warriors who could probably kill her before she even finished drawing the blade. The leader dismounted with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of years of combat training, a massive man with ice-blue eyes and a scarred face, and the bearing of someone who'd seen more battles than Sarah had seen sunrises. And he looked at her with an intensity that made her want to back away. Except there was nowhere to go with 11 other riders blocking every escape route. He pulled out a rolled parchment from his jacket and unrolled it with deliberate slowness, and Sarah saw the royal seal stamped in silver wax at the bottom, and her stomach dropped because royal decrees were never good news for rogue Omegas with no pack affiliation and questionable reputations. And she braced herself for arrest or worse, for being accused of some crime she didn't commit, or being forced into service for some pack that wanted to use her healing abilities without caring about her as a person. But when the captain spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded almost like desperation, rather than authority, and he said that King Aldrich Sylvanus of the Northern Apex Kingdom was dying, that a poison was killing him slowly and painfully, despite the efforts of 47 healers from across the known world, and that all Omegas with significant healing ability were being summoned to the royal city to attempt to save him, and refusal to comply with this summons was punishable by imprisonment, because the kingdom couldn't afford to lose their king. Not now. Not when they were so close to negotiating a lasting peace with the Eastern territories. Sarah tried to tell him that she wasn't what they were looking for, that she was a failure who couldn't even save her own brother, much less a dying king, that she would only disappoint them the way she'd disappointed everyone else who'd ever trusted her with someone's life. But the captain wasn't listening to her protests because his eyes had fixed on her face, and more specifically on her hair, which had fallen out of her hood during her startled movement when the horses had surrounded her, and his expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something that looked almost like shock or recognition or hope. He said something that made Sarah's blood run cold in her veins, said that King Aldrich had silver hair like hers, that his mother, Queen Celeste, had possessed silver hair and had been the greatest healer their kingdom had ever known, that she'd made a prophecy before she died about a silver-haired Omega who would come when death had its claws in her son and would be the only one capable of saving him. And the captain was looking at Sarah like she was the answer to prayers she hadn't known anyone was praying, like she was somehow important instead of cursed, like maybe her silver hair meant something other than failure and death and rejection. Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, wanted to tell him that prophecies were just stories people told themselves to make sense of random chance, that she was nobody special, just a broken healer who'd failed the people who mattered most and had been running from that failure ever since. But before she could form the words, the captain had gestured to his men, and they'd lifted her onto a horse with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd done this sort of thing before. And suddenly, Sarah was riding toward the royal city, whether she wanted to or not, riding toward a dying king and a destiny she didn't believe in, and a future that terrified her more than any amount of wandering alone through hostile wilderness ever could. The northern apex castle rose from the mountainside like something carved from winter itself, all white stone and silver spires that caught the fading autumn light and transformed it into something ethereal and otherworldly. And Sarah found herself staring up at the massive structure with a mixture of awe and terror, because this was so far beyond anything she'd ever imagined for herself, so completely removed from the life of a wandering rogue healer that she couldn't quite process the reality of riding through gates that were guarded by soldiers in pristine uniforms who bowed their heads respectfully as Captain Theron led their procession through courtyards filled with nobles and servants who stopped their conversations to stare at the strange, silver-haired Omega being escorted like she was someone important instead of someone who'd been eating stale bread and sleeping on forest floors for the past 3 years. The ride from Grey Hollow had taken 2 days of hard travel, and Sarah had spent every moment of those 2 days trying to convince herself that this was all some terrible mistake, that when they arrived at the castle and she attempted to heal the king, she would fail just like she'd failed with Thomas, just like she'd failed with so many others despite her best efforts. And then she'd be thrown in prison or executed for wasting the kingdom's time. Or worse, she'd be blamed for the king's death and become known across all territories as the cursed silver-haired Omega who'd killed the most powerful alpha in the northern lands. Captain Theron helped her dismount with surprising gentleness for such a large and battle-scarred warrior, and Sarah's legs were shaky from 2 days of riding when she'd spent the previous 3 years traveling exclusively on foot. But she forced herself to stand straight and maintain some shred of dignity, even though she was acutely aware of how she must look to all these refined court nobles in their silk and velvet, with her threadbare cloak and her travel-stained dress and her silver hair that hadn't been properly brushed in days and probably looked like a bird's nest of tangles and knots. The captain led her through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past tapestries that depicted great battles and royal lineages, past windows that looked out over mountain valleys so beautiful they made her chest ache with a longing she couldn't quite name, past servants who pressed themselves against walls to let them pass, and whispered behind their hands about the strange Omega the elite guard had brought back from their recruiting mission. They stopped finally in front of a set of carved wooden doors, and Captain Theron knocked once before pushing them open to reveal a room that was clearly dedicated to healing work, with shelves full of herbs and potions and medical texts, with tables covered in surgical instruments and bandages, and all the tools of a healer's trade. And standing in the center of all this organized chaos was a woman who looked to be in her early 60s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical bun, and warm brown eyes that assessed Sarah with the kind of sharp intelligence that saw far more than surface appearances. The woman introduced herself as Elena Ravensong, head royal healer, and she looked at Sarah with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and something that might have been hope. And she said that she'd been serving the royal family for 40 years, had trained under Queen Celeste herself before the Queen's untimely death, and had personally overseen the attempts of 47 different healers to save King Aldrich from the poison that was slowly crystallizing his blood and turning his body into a battlefield where death was winning inch by painful inch. Elena gestured for Sarah to sit at a large wooden table that was covered in papers and journals, and as Sarah lowered herself into the chair, she saw that these weren't just random documents, but rather detailed notes on every single healing attempt that had been made over the past 6 months, 47 different approaches from 47 different healers, each one more desperate and creative than the last, and all of them had failed to do more than slow the poison's progression for a few hours, or at most a few days, before it adapted and continued its relentless work of destroying the king from the inside out. Elena explained that the poison was called Nightshade Wraith, a rare and ancient toxin that had been created specifically to kill alpha bloodlines, that it was magical in nature and couldn't be counteracted by normal healing methods, because it was sentient in its own terrible way, learning and adapting to whatever treatment was applied, growing stronger with each failed attempt to remove it. And the king had perhaps 2 weeks left to live, maybe 3 if they were very lucky, before the crystallization reached his heart and killed him in a matter of hours with pain so excruciating that even the strongest alpha would beg for death before the end came. Sarah felt her hands beginning to shake as she listened to Elena's clinical description of how the king was dying, felt the familiar weight of failure settling over her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Because how could she possibly succeed where 47 other healers had failed? Healers who probably had proper training and prestigious credentials, and years of experience that she couldn't hope to match with her self-taught methods, and her instinctive approach to healing that she'd learned more from desperation than from any formal education. She tried to say as much to Elena, tried to explain that she wasn't qualified for this, that she'd failed more people than she'd saved, and that her silver hair wasn't a mark of destiny, but rather a mark of her greatest failure, the physical manifestation of her inability to save her own brother when he'd needed her most. But Elena was looking at her with such intensity that the words died in Sarah's throat before she could finish voicing all her doubts and fears and deeply held certainties about her own inadequacy. Elena reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in her own, and Sarah felt a jolt of something like recognition pass between them, a sense that this older woman could see straight through all her defenses and protective walls to the broken girl underneath, who was still trying to atone for deaths that had never been her fault in the first place. And Elena said, in a voice that was both gentle and implacable, that she could feel the power in Sarah's hands, could sense the healing gift that ran through her like a river of liquid silver. And that kind of power didn't come from failure or curse, but rather from a deep connection to life itself, to the fundamental forces that bound all living things together in a web of energy and intention that most wolves could only dimly perceive, but that true healers could see and touch and manipulate with the right training and the right motivation. Elena told her that Queen Celeste had possessed that same gift, that same connection to life magic that went beyond normal healing abilities into something older and more primal, something the ancient texts called life weaving, because it allowed the healer to literally weave together the threads of life force that connected all living beings, to pull energy from one source and channel it into another, to dissolve death magic with the pure application of life itself. And Elena believed that Sarah possessed that same rare and precious gift, even if she'd never been taught to recognize it or use it properly. Before Sarah could respond to this overwhelming declaration, before she could process the implications of what Elena was suggesting about her abilities and her potential, the door burst open and a woman swept into the room like a storm front moving across a clear sky. All elaborate curls and expensive silk, and the kind of beauty that came from generations of selective breeding among noble bloodlines. The woman was perhaps a year or two younger than Sarah, with glossy black hair and striking green eyes, and the kind of porcelain skin that had never known a day of hard labor or deprivation. And she looked at Sarah with barely concealed disdain, her gaze traveling from Sarah's tangled silver hair down to her worn boots and back up again, with an expression that made it abundantly clear what she thought of this ragged Omega, who'd been dragged in from the wilderness to attempt what so many better healers had already failed to accomplish. The woman introduced herself as Lady Cassia Nightshade, daughter of Duke Nightshade, and a frequent visitor to the royal court, and she said with saccharine sweetness that dripped with poison more toxic than anything affecting the king, that she was sure this newest healer would be just as successful as all the others, which was to say, not successful at all, and perhaps it would save everyone time and disappointment if they simply accepted that some battles couldn't be won and started preparing for the inevitable transition of power that would come when the king finally succumbed to his condition. Elena's face hardened at Cassia's words, and she said with steel in her voice that as long as King Aldrich drew breath, they would continue fighting for his life with every resource at their disposal. And if Lady Cassia had nothing constructive to contribute, then perhaps she should take her defeatist attitude elsewhere and let the healers do their work without interference from nobles who thought their bloodlines gave them the right to pass judgment on matters they didn't understand. Cassia's beautiful face twisted into something ugly for just a moment before she smoothed her expression back into aristocratic disdain, and she said that she was only trying to be realistic about the situation, that she cared deeply for the king's well-being, of course, and she would be devastated if he died. But surely everyone could see that bringing in rogue Omegas with questionable backgrounds was scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of viable options, and she swept out of the room with her silk skirts rustling and her head held high, like a queen who'd just put commoners in their proper place. Sarah felt something cold and hard settling in her chest, felt all the old insecurities and doubts that Damien's rejection had carved into her soul rising up like ghosts she couldn't exorcise no matter how far she ran or how many people she helped. Because Cassia was right, wasn't she? Sarah was just a rogue Omega with no credentials and no pack, and a history of failure that followed her like a shadow. And what possible right did she have to think she could succeed, where 47 trained and experienced healers had already exhausted every option they could conceive? Elena seemed to sense the direction of Sarah's thoughts, because she squeezed her hands tighter and said that Cassia Nightshade had been trying to position herself as the future Luna for 2 years now, had been throwing herself at King Aldrich with increasingly desperate tactics, and she saw every other Omega as a threat to her ambitions, regardless of whether those Omegas had any interest in the king beyond keeping him alive. And Sarah shouldn't let the jealous machinations of a spoiled noblewoman undermine her confidence in her own abilities or her worth as a healer and as a person. But before Sarah could respond to Elena's reassurances, before she could even begin to process the implications of what the head healer had just revealed about court politics and romantic rivalries, Captain Theron appeared in the doorway looking more agitated than Sarah had seen him during their entire 2-day journey, and he said that the king was asking to meet the new healer immediately, that he'd heard about her arrival and wanted to assess her himself before another healing attempt was made, and Elena needed to bring her to the king's study right away, because His Majesty was in one of his increasingly rare windows of relative lucidity before the next seizure hit and rendered him incapable of coherent conversation for hours. Sarah's heart started hammering in her chest with a panic that made her feel lightheaded and sick, because she wasn't ready for this. Wasn't ready to meet the dying king and see the hope in his eyes that she knew she would inevitably disappoint. Wasn't ready to stand in front of someone who'd been described to her as the greatest alpha of his generation and admit that she was probably going to fail him, just like she'd failed everyone else who'd ever trusted her with their lives. Elena led her through more corridors that blurred together in Sarah's anxiety-fogged mind, and she was vaguely aware of passing more nobles and servants and guards, of climbing stairs that seemed to go on forever, of moving deeper into the private sections of the castle, where only the royal family and their most trusted advisors were typically allowed. And then they were standing in front of a heavy oak door, and Elena was knocking, and a voice from inside was telling them to enter, and Sarah felt like she was walking to her own execution as she followed Elena into a study that was filled with books and maps and weapons mounted on walls, and the lingering scent of something that reminded her of winter forests and snow-covered mountains, and power so concentrated it made the air itself feel heavy with potential. The man sitting behind the massive desk was trying very hard to appear strong and capable and in control, but Sarah's healer senses immediately cataloged all the signs that he was barely holding himself together through sheer force of will, and she saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he set down the document he'd been reading, saw the tension in his shoulders that spoke of constant pain being endured and suppressed, saw the shadows under his eyes that came from too many sleepless nights and too much suffering compressed into too short a time. But what stopped her breath in her lungs and made her heart stutter in her chest wasn't the evidence of his illness or his suffering, but rather the moment when he looked up and she saw his face properly for the first time, saw the strong features that would have been classically handsome if not for the pallor of sickness and the tightness of pain around his eyes, saw the silver eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal light, even dimmed as they were by his condition, and most importantly, saw the silver hair that fell to his shoulders in waves that caught the lamplight and transformed it into something luminous and otherworldly. Silver hair exactly like her own, the mark that had made her an outcast and a symbol of curse and failure in every pack she'd ever known. King Aldrich Sylvanus stood slowly from his desk, moving with careful deliberation that suggested every movement cost him more than he wanted to show. And he looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing past her ragged appearance and her defensive walls straight down to her soul. And for a moment, neither of them spoke because there was something happening between them that went beyond words. Some recognition that felt like memory, even though they'd never met before. Like an echo of something ancient and profound that had been waiting for this exact moment to manifest. The king opened his mouth to speak, to welcome her, or question her, or whatever protocol demanded in this situation. But before he could form the words, his entire body went rigid and his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed behind his desk with a sound that would haunt Sarah's nightmares for years to come, if she lived long enough to have nightmares about anything other than all the people she'd failed to save. Elena shouted for the guards and started to rush around the desk, but Sarah was already moving, was already dropping to her knees beside the king, who was convulsing on the floor, with blood seeping from his nose and his mouth. And she could see the poison working in real time, could sense the dark magic crystallizing his blood and sending shards of agony through every nerve in his body. And she placed her hands on his chest, without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences or the likelihood of failure, and she pushed everything she had into him, every ounce of healing energy she could summon, every bit of life force she could channel, and she felt something shift inside her, like a door opening onto a vast reservoir of power she'd never known existed. Silver-white light erupted from her hands and flooded into the king's body, and Sarah felt the poison recoiling from her touch, like it was a living thing that recognized a threat to its existence. Felt it fighting her with a malevolence that confirmed everything Elena had said about this. Being dark magic designed specifically to kill, but she pushed harder, poured more of herself into the battle happening inside this dying king's body, and slowly, incrementally, impossibly, the seizure began to subside, the convulsions becoming less violent, the rigid tension in his muscles easing, his breathing becoming less labored and more regular. The light faded after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and Sarah found herself gasping for breath and covered in sweat and shaking from exhaustion. And she looked down to see King Aldrich's silver eyes open and staring up at her with an expression of wonder and hope, and something else that she couldn't quite identify, but that made her want to run from the room and never look back because she recognized it somehow. Recognized it from dreams she'd had and prophecies she didn't believe in, and fairy tales about fated mates that she'd always dismissed as romantic nonsense designed to make lonely wolves feel better about their solitary existence. The king reached up with a trembling hand and touched her face, his fingers ghosting across her cheek with a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with everything she knew about powerful alphas and dying kings. And he whispered in a voice rough with emotion and pain, and something that sounded almost like reverence, that she had silver hair like his mother's, like the prophecy had foretold, and he'd been waiting for her, waiting for the silver-haired healer who would come when death had its claws deepest in him. And she was here now. She was finally here. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to die after all. Sarah wanted to tell him not to hope, wanted to warn him that she failed more than she succeeded, that her silver hair was a curse, not a blessing, that he shouldn't trust her with his life because she'd proven time and again that she couldn't save the people who mattered most. But before she could voice any of these warnings, before she could erect the defensive walls that had kept her safe and isolated for 3 years, the king's hand fell away from her face, and his eyes closed, and he passed into unconsciousness. And Elena was pulling her away from his body and examining him with professional efficiency, and declaring that the seizure had stopped faster than any seizure in the past 6 months, that his vital signs were stronger than they'd been in weeks, that something Sarah had done had actually worked where nothing else had even come close to working. Captain Theron and 4 other guards carefully lifted the unconscious king and carried him toward his private chambers, and Elena was talking rapidly about running tests and documenting what had happened and preparing for more intensive healing sessions now that they knew Sarah's gift could actually affect the poison. But Sarah couldn't focus on anything Elena was saying because her hands were still glowing faintly with residual silver light, and she could still feel the echo of the connection she'd made with the king's life force, could still sense the poison lurking in his blood like a predator waiting to strike again. And more terrifying than any of that was the certainty settling into her bones that this man, this dying king with silver hair like hers, was her mate, her destined partner, the other half of her soul that the moon goddess had supposedly created specifically to complete her. And she had absolutely no idea what she was supposed to do with that knowledge, except try desperately not to fail him the way she'd failed everyone else she'd ever loved. Because losing him would destroy her in ways that her brother's death and Damien's rejection had only begun to accomplish. And Sarah wasn't sure she could survive being broken any more completely than she already was. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of healing sessions and sleepless nights and gradual, terrifying recognition that Sarah was falling in love with a man who might still die despite her best efforts. And every day she spent hours with her hands pressed against his bare chest, feeling the poison slowly, incrementally dissolving under the constant application of her life-weaving gift, while the mate bond between them grew stronger and more undeniable until the air practically crackled with silver energy whenever they were in the same room together. King Aldrich had chambers that were larger than any building Sarah had lived in during her 3 years of wandering, with a massive bed carved from dark wood and windows that looked out over mountain peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. And it was in this intimate space that they spent hours each day with him, sitting shirtless on the edge of his bed, while she channeled healing energy through her palms into the core of his being, burning away the crystallized death magic that had been slowly killing him for 6 months, while 47 other healers had tried and failed to accomplish what she was managing through sheer stubborn determination and the inexplicable power that seemed to multiply whenever she touched him. They talked during these sessions, at first about inconsequential things like the weather or castle gossip or the logistics of running a kingdom. But gradually, their conversations deepened into territory that Sarah had never explored with anyone, not even Damien during their 2 years of courtship, and she found herself telling Aldrich about Thomas and the plague that had killed him, about the way her hair had turned silver overnight, as if her body was manifesting the darkness she'd absorbed from watching 47 people die, including her baby brother, about Damien's rejection and the 3 years she'd spent wandering, because staying in one place meant risking attachment, and attachment meant inevitable pain when people inevitably decided she was too strange, or too cursed, or too much of a liability to keep around. Aldrich listened to her confessions with an attention that made her feel seen in ways she'd never experienced before, and he shared his own stories about losing his mother to a wasting illness when he was 16, about how she'd known she was dying and had used her gift of prophecy to see the future and had told him about the silver-haired Omega who would save his life when death came for him, about how he'd been searching for her for 12 years without even knowing what he was searching for until the moment she'd walked into his study with silver hair, exactly like his mother's, and eyes that held galaxies of pain and strength in equal measure. He told her during their 5th healing session, when the poison was perhaps 25% dissolved, and he was strong enough to walk the castle gardens without collapsing, that he'd known she was his mate from the first moment he'd seen her, that the bond had snapped into place with such force It had nearly knocked him unconscious even before the seizure hit. And he'd been waiting for her to feel it too. Waiting for her to acknowledge what was so obvious to him, that it was like trying to ignore the sun in a cloudless sky. Sarah had tried to deny it at first, had insisted that what she was feeling was just gratitude for being given purpose, or sympathy for his suffering, or anything other than the soul-deep recognition that this man was her destined partner. But Aldrich had simply smiled with infinite patience and said that she could deny it as long as she needed to, that he would wait for her to accept the truth because he'd already waited 12 years, and a few more weeks or months wouldn't make any difference to someone who'd been half alive and searching for his other half since the day his mother had died and left him alone to rule a kingdom without the person who was supposed to stand beside him. Lady Cassia had made several more attempts to undermine Sarah's position, spreading rumors about her questionable past and her rogue status, and the suspicious timing of her arrival, just when the king was at his weakest. But the rumors had died quick deaths when Elena had publicly vouched for Sarah's character and abilities, and when Captain Theron had made it clear that anyone questioning the healer who was saving their king's life would answer to him personally in the training yard with weapons of their choosing. The real complication had come when a delegation from Riverside Pack arrived seeking trade agreements. And Sarah had been in the healing gardens gathering herbs when she'd heard a voice that made her blood run cold and her hands shake so badly she'd dropped the basket she was carrying, scattering chamomile and lavender across the stone path because Damien Blackwater was striding toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and words about mistakes and second chances already forming on his lips before he'd even reached her side. He'd tried to say that he'd made an error in judgment, that he'd been young and foolish and pressured by pack elders who didn't understand what they were asking him to give up. And now that he'd heard rumors about a silver-haired healer working miracles in the royal castle, he'd come to see if it was really her, and discovering that it was, had made him realize what he'd lost when he'd rejected her in front of the entire pack 3 years ago. Sarah had listened to his rehearsed speech, with growing fury that she'd suppressed for 3 years suddenly boiling over. And she'd told him with her voice shaking, but her words clear and sharp as broken glass, that he didn't get to decide he'd made a mistake now that she was important to someone, now that she had value in the eyes of the kingdom, now that saying he knew the king's healer might elevate his own status among the packs, because when she'd had nothing, when she'd been nobody, when she'd needed someone to believe in her worth, he'd called her cursed and ripped up their mate contract and let her be banished without speaking a single word in her defense. Aldrich had appeared while Damien was still trying to formulate a response, had materialized beside Sarah with the quiet authority of someone who ruled millions and who was strong enough now after weeks of healing to make that authority felt in every line of his body. And he'd looked at Damien with eyes that had gone cold as winter storms and asked in a voice that could have cut diamond whether there was a problem that needed the king's personal attention. Damien had backpedaled immediately, had stammered something about old friends catching up, and no problem at all, Your Majesty. But Aldrich had simply placed a possessive hand on the small of Sarah's back and said that Sarah was under royal protection, that her past associations were no longer relevant to her present position, and that if Damien had business with the kingdom, it should be conducted through proper diplomatic channels, rather than by ambushing the king's healer in private gardens. The delegation from Riverside Pack had left 2 days later with significantly less favorable trade terms than they'd hoped for, and Sarah had never seen Damien again, had finally been able to close that chapter of her life and stopped giving him power over her present through the weight of his past rejection. The real crisis had come during the 4th week of healing sessions, when the poison was perhaps 60% dissolved, but the remaining 40% was concentrated around Aldrich's heart and fighting back with increasing desperation, as if it knew its time was running out and wanted to take its host down with it before being completely eradicated. Sarah had been performing a particularly intense healing session, pouring more of her life force than was probably safe into dissolving the crystallized death magic that clung to Aldrich's heart like parasitic vines. When the door had burst open and Damien had rushed in with two men she didn't recognize, and before anyone could react, he'd drawn a knife and lunged toward Aldrich with murder in his eyes and confession already spilling from his lips about how he'd been the one to arrange the poisoning 6 months ago. How he'd paid an assassin from the Eastern Coalition to poison the king during diplomatic negotiations. How the plan had been to destabilize the Northern Apex Kingdom and position Riverside Pack as essential allies in exchange for power and territory, and influence they could never achieve through legitimate means. Sarah had thrown herself between Damien and Aldrich without thinking, without considering that she was a small Omega facing a trained warrior with a weapon, without calculating odds or considering consequences, and she'd felt the knife slide between her ribs with a cold shock that seemed distant and unimportant compared to the need to protect the man she loved from the man who'd already destroyed her once and wasn't going to get the chance to destroy anyone else she cared about. The pain had come a moment later, white hot and spreading through her chest like fire. And she'd heard Aldrich roar with a fury that shook the castle walls as he'd shifted partially, his alpha power erupting even though the poison should have prevented such a transformation. And he'd torn into Damien and his conspirators with claws and teeth and rage that came from somewhere primal and unstoppable, while Captain Theron and the elite guards burst through the doors and subdued the attackers before Aldrich could kill them all with his bare hands. Sarah had collapsed with blood spreading across her dress in a warm, sticky pool, and she'd been vaguely aware of Aldrich kneeling beside her, with panic transforming his features into something wild and desperate. And Elena had been there too, shouting orders to servants about bringing healing supplies and clearing the room. And then Elena had said something that cut through the fog of pain and shock, had said that the knife had been poisoned with a different toxin than the one that had been killing Aldrich. Something fast-acting that would stop Sarah's heart within minutes unless they did something drastic. Unless they took a risk that could save her or kill them both. Aldrich had demanded to know what risk, what option, what possible solution existed when Sarah was dying in front of him and he couldn't lose her, couldn't survive losing the woman who'd saved his life and stolen his heart and made him understand what his mother had meant when she'd said that true mates completed each other in ways that transcended simple companionship or romantic love. Elena had explained with clinical precision, even though her hands were shaking, that the only way to save Sarah was to complete the mate bond, for Aldrich to mark her and channel his alpha power through the bond to burn away the poison in her blood. But the danger was that he still had poison in his own system. 40% of the Nightshade Wraith clinging to his heart, and using that much power in his condition could kill him, could make the remaining poison crystallize instantly and stop his heart before the bond could even settle into place. Sarah had tried to tell them no, had tried to say that she wasn't worth the risk, that Aldrich needed to live because he was a king and his people needed him, and she was just a rogue Omega who'd already lived longer than she'd expected after being exiled. But Aldrich had ignored her protests and gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that seemed impossible given the violence he'd just unleashed on her attackers. And he'd told her that he loved her, that he'd loved her from the moment she'd walked into his study with silver hair and sad eyes and hands that held more power than she'd ever been taught to recognize. And he would rather die trying to save her than live without her in a world that would be gray and empty and meaningless if she wasn't in it. He'd bitten her neck before she could argue further. his teeth sinking into the sensitive junction where her shoulder met her throat, and the mate bond had exploded into existence with such force that silver-white light had filled the entire room and spilled out through the windows and lit up the whole castle like a beacon. And Sarah had felt his soul pouring into hers through the connection, had experienced every memory and emotion and desperate hope he'd carried for 12 years, while waiting for the mate his mother had promised would come. She'd seen herself through his eyes, had seen that he thought she was beautiful, that her silver hair wasn't a curse, but a crown that marked her as extraordinary, that every scar and wound and moment of suffering had shaped her into exactly the woman he needed beside him, strong enough to face death and compassionate enough to heal those who were broken, and brave enough to risk everything for someone she loved. The alpha power had surged through the bond like lightning finding ground, and Sarah had felt the poison in her blood burning away under the combined force of their connection, had felt her wound beginning to close as the bond accelerated her healing beyond anything she could have achieved on her own. And then she'd realized that her own healing gift was flowing backward through the bond into Aldrich, that together they were creating a circuit of power that was dissolving the last of the nightshade wraith that clung to his heart, that they were saving each other simultaneously through the force of their love and their bond, and their absolute refusal to let death claim either of them when they'd only just found each other after years of searching and waiting and hoping. The light had grown so bright that Elena had to shield her eyes, and when it finally faded, both Sarah and Aldrich were glowing with residual silver energy, and the bond between them was settled and perfect and complete. And she could feel his emotions like they were her own, could sense his presence even with her eyes closed, could hear his thoughts whispering through their connection that she was his and he was hers, and nothing would ever separate them again. The official mating ceremony had been held under the full moon 2 weeks later, after Sarah had fully recovered and after Damien and his co-conspirators had been tried and sentenced to life imprisonment, and the entire kingdom had gathered to witness their king claim his prophesied Luna, the silver-haired healer who'd arrived when all hope seemed lost and had saved their beloved ruler through powers that seemed to come straight from the moon goddess herself. Sarah had worn a gown that Elena had commissioned specially for the occasion, silver silk that seemed to be woven from moonlight itself, and her long silver hair had been left flowing down her back and adorned with winter roses and diamonds that caught the firelight and made her look like something from an ancient legend. Aldrich had stood before the assembled crowd in white and silver, looking every inch the powerful Alpha King he'd been born to be. And when he'd marked her again in front of thousands of witnesses, when he'd claimed her publicly as his mate and Luna and equal, the bond between them had pulsed with such joy that several people in the crowd had said later they'd felt it in their own chests, had experienced an echo of the love that connected the king and his healer in ways that transcended anything they'd ever witnessed before. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the castle healing wing, training a young girl who'd arrived the previous week. A 16-year-old Omega with silver-streaked hair who'd been rejected by her pack for failing to save her mother from a wasting illness. And Sarah looked at this broken, frightened child and saw herself as she'd been before Aldrich, before the bond, before she'd learned that the things the world called weaknesses were actually strengths waiting to be recognized and developed and celebrated. She told the girl her story, all of it, the deaths and the rejection and the 3 years of wandering, and then the summons and the healing sessions and the mate bond that had saved them both, and she watched understanding dawn in the girl's eyes as she realized that maybe, just maybe, her silver hair wasn't a curse, but a blessing that she simply hadn't learned to interpret correctly yet. Aldrich entered the healing wing, carrying their daughter Celeste, a 3-year-old bundle of energy with silver hair and violet-gray eyes, who immediately wriggled out of her father's arms and ran to Sarah, calling, "Mama!" with the kind of pure joy that still made Sarah's heart clench with gratitude for the life she'd been given. The life she'd nearly thrown away because she'd believed the lies people told about her being cursed and broken beyond repair. The young healer watched this interaction with wonder. Watched the way Aldrich looked at Sarah like she'd hung the moon and stars specifically for him. Watched the way little Celeste demanded to be picked up and held by both parents at once. And Sarah could see the exact moment when hope began to replace despair in the girl's expression, when she started to believe that maybe her story didn't have to end in isolation and failure and endless wandering through a world that couldn't see past her appearance to the gift that lay dormant beneath her skin. Sarah offered the girl a place in the castle, offered to teach her everything Elena had taught her about life-weaving and healing magic, and the ancient arts that most modern healers had forgotten. And she watched tears of relief and gratitude stream down the girl's face as she accepted, as she took the first step toward discovering that her silver hair wasn't marking her for death, but rather marking her for a destiny she couldn't yet imagine, but that the moon goddess had been preparing for her since before she was born. Years later, when Sarah was old and Aldrich's silver hair had gone white and their children had children of their own, she would still remember that moment in the healing wing when she'd recognized herself in a broken girl's eyes and had been able to offer hope where once she'd only known despair. And she would think about how close she'd come to missing all of this, all the love and joy and purpose that had filled her life since the day 12 riders in white uniforms had surrounded her on a forest road and told her about a dying king and a prophecy and a destiny she'd been running from her entire life without even knowing what she was running from. She'd believed she was cursed, that her silver hair marked her as an agent of death, that everyone she loved would die because she was fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. But the truth was that she'd been blessed all along, marked by the moon goddess as special and powerful and destined for greatness. And it had taken a dying king and a mate bond and nearly losing everything before she'd been able to see that the curse had only ever existed in her own mind, perpetuated by people who feared what they didn't understand and who'd rather exile someone different than examine their own prejudices and limitations. The silver hair that had made her an outcast had led her to her true home. The gift that had seemed like failure had proven to be the most powerful magic in the kingdom. And the rejection that had broken her heart had freed her to find a love so profound and complete that it had literally saved both their lives when death had come calling with poison and knives and the malice of small men who couldn't stand to see others rise above their station. Sarah had learned that sometimes the moon goddess had to break you completely before she could remake you into something stronger. That sometimes rejection was redirection toward the path you were always meant to walk. That sometimes what looked like a curse was actually a blessing wrapped in suffering that would eventually transform into more joy than you'd ever imagined possible. And she spent the rest of her long and happy life teaching that lesson to every broken soul who found their way to her door. Every silver-haired healer who thought they were alone, every rejected Omega who believed they were unworthy of love, because she knew from hard-won experience that the moon goddess didn't make mistakes. that every scar and wound and moment of suffering served a purpose in shaping you into the person you needed to be, and that true love, mate bonds, and destined connections were worth waiting for, even when you'd given up hope that they would ever arrive. If you enjoyed Seraphina and Aldrich's story of healing, redemption, and fated love, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale of Alpha Kings, powerful Omegas, rejected mates who find their true destinies, and the bonds that transform curse into blessing and despair into hope beyond measure. And leave a comment below telling me what you thought of their journey from broken healer and dying king to mated rulers who saved each other in every way that mattered. Because your support and engagement means everything and helps me continue creating these stories of love, conquering fear, of compassion, proving stronger than rejection, of silver-haired souls finding each other across impossible distances and overcoming every obstacle that fate and malice placed in their path. So hit that notification bell and let me know what kind of werewolf romance you'd like to see next, whether it's more healing magic and prophecies fulfilled, or perhaps rejected mates discovering second chances, or maybe Alpha Kings testing potential Lunas through trials that reveal true character. Because there are endless stories waiting to be told about wolves who find love in unexpected places and learn that what the world calls weakness is actually the greatest strength of all.